In 1943, America was losing the air war over Europe. Not because the crews weren't brave, not because the planes lacked firepower. It was because a 19-year-old gunner could squeeze off 130 .50 caliber rounds at a fighter and watch every single one disappear into empty air. Imagine firing a storm of lead and feeling utterly helpless. Imagine the knot in a kid's stomach as tracer after tracer skips past a plane that never blinks. That wasn't a fluke. It was a catastrophe with a cause, a hidden error in how we aimed. And the search for why would force a revolution in how we fight, and even how we think. December 1942. Inside the vibrating ball turret of a B-17, 19-year-old gunner Eddie Kowalski hangs like a spider in a glass globe. The world reduced to cold metal, a narrow window, and the crosshairs in his sight. He squints through the glass, a Japanese Zero carving through the sky. And at the end of his nerves is the decision to pull the trigger. Kowalski squeezes the triggers, and the world explodes into gunfire. The M2's staccato spits tracer orange ribbons and a waterfall of .50 caliber rounds, belts tearing free, casing spitting, the turret shuddering under the recoil. It's a storm of lead, every shot meant to rip the Zero out of the sky. He fires until his arms burn and his breath comes in ragged bursts. But the Zero dances through the onslaught, completely untouched. Tracers stitch the sky around it, slashes of fire that never bite. Kowalski watches rounds tear past the cockpit as if the enemy were a ghost. The fighter slips between streams of lead, curls away on a breath of cloud, and is gone, leaving only disbelief in its wake. Kowalski's failure wasn't an anomaly. It was the terrifying norm across every theater of the war. Young gunners in spinning turrets and open blisters over Europe, the Pacific, even the deserts and Mediterranean did exactly what they'd been taught. They poured lead, fingers clenched on triggers, tracers streaking past like ghostly ribbons. Yet enemy fighters seemed to dance through the fire, untouched. It wasn't cowardice or bad guns. It was a mismatch between human instinct and a brutal bit of physics. By the time the bullet arrived, the target had already moved. This was systemic. And soon, the numbers would make that truth unavoidable. The study blew the myth apart. In 1943, the Army Air Forces ran the numbers, and the result was brutal. Against a crossing enemy fighter, even America's best-trained gunners only managed a hit rate under 4%. That isn't a statistic, it's a sentence. It meant tens of thousands of rounds burning uselessly through the sky while enemy planes slipped through like ghosts. It meant brave crews thinking they were fighting back and failing. It turned a handful of near misses into a systemic catastrophe and forced commanders to stop blaming courage or steel and start asking how to outthink a problem that was really math, not morale. To put that in perspective, the standard Browning M2 fires about 13 rounds a second, not single cracks, but an unbroken mechanical spray of .50 caliber lead, loud, relentless, designed to bury a target in bullets the moment you squeeze the trigger. In a typical 10-second engagement, a gunner isn't firing polite, measured bursts. He's unleashing over 130 rounds, a thunder of .50 caliber lead screaming out the turret. 13 rounds a second, tracers like angry comets streaking past. It sounds like enough to tear a fighter from the sky, but volume alone doesn't solve the geometry of a moving target. 4%. Of the 130 or so rounds a gunner could send toward a threat in a single engagement, only about 5 would actually hit. 5 hits, not enough to punch through armored engines, shred control surfaces, or start the kinds of fires that bring a fighter down. Instead, those bullets splashed harmlessly through empty air, tracers arcing and disappearing like rain. Men did everything they were taught, squeezing triggers, tracking targets, but the math and the physics were stacked against them. That tiny probability turned bravery into vulnerability, and it would cost crews and planes in ways that statistics alone couldn't capture. The cost wasn't just planes, it was blood. In 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing, on average, 188 bombers every single month. Think about that for a second. Crews of 10 tight-knit men who climbed into those aircraft together, shredded and gone. Nearly 2,000 lives ripped from the fight each month as steel and fire fell out of the sky. Losses like that hollowed out morale, strained replacements, and turned every mission into a gamble with human stakes. And yet the pilots and gunners were doing their jobs, brave, trained, while something invisible kept cutting them down. They were doing everything right, following drill, holding breath, counting bursts, yet they kept falling out of the sky. It wasn't cowardice, poor aim, or faulty guns. It was a simple, brutal law of physics that turned courage into casualty. Lead takes time to get there, and fast-moving fighters don't hang around waiting. In the flash of tracers and the howl of wind, a 19-year-old could do everything his instructors taught and still watch enemy planes slip through the empty spaces between his bullets. It was a cruel realization. The problem wasn't the men. It was the way motion, time, and perception conspired against them. The true enemy wasn't flak or faulty guns, and it wasn't a lack of courage. It was an invisible force the men named deflection error. It sounds like jargon, but its effect was heartbreakingly simple. A bullet takes time to get where you point it, and in that sliver of time, the enemy has already moved. That tiny delay turns instinct into a liability. You see the plane, you point at the plane, and your rounds all sail into the empty air where the plane used to be. It wasn't a failure of will. It was a blind spot in perception, a math problem the human brain couldn't solve in a split second. Because a bullet isn't instantaneous, the war wasn't just about courage or aim, it was about time. A round leaves the muzzle and then spends a measurable fraction of a second flying through space. In that blink, a fighter screaming across the sky at hundreds of miles an hour doesn't hang still. It keeps moving, fast enough to cross yards, then tens of yards by the time the lead round gets there. So the target you see is already a ghost of where it will be. That tiny delay is the root of the deadly problem. You can't point at the plane and expect to hit it. You can't hit a moving fighter by pointing at its nose. A bullet, even from a 50 cal, takes time. Time enough for that plane to slide cleanly out of the path. So you don't aim at the aircraft. You aim at the empty patch of sky where it will be when your rounds arrive. Picture it. Not the metal in your crosshairs, but a ghost of space ahead. It's brutal, elegant math, and completely counterintuitive. It fights the gut instinct to lock on the threat. On paper, it sounds simple. In a screaming turret, under fire, doing it is another thing entirely. They even had a name for it, leading the target. The simple math of aiming at where the enemy will be, not where he is. On paper, airmen and engineers could write the equations, measure speed and distance, and prove it would work. In the turret, though, theory collided with terror. Wind, vibration, frost on the glass, tracers flashing past, a fighter whipping across your sight in 3 frantic seconds, and your reflex screams to point right at the threat. Knowing the solution and doing it under fire are 2 different worlds, and that gap was killing crews. This wasn't a failure of courage or math so much as a quirk of our wiring. The human brain is hardwired to react to a threat by pointing at it, not at where it will be. Evolution favored split-second responses. See danger, aim at danger, shoot, because on the savannah, that reflex saved lives. In a high-speed skyfight, that same reflex becomes a deadly lie. Under stress, eyes lock, hands follow, and the mind refuses to aim at empty air. Knowing the physics of lead is one thing. Overriding a survival instinct with calm calculation is another entirely, and it's exactly what most training never managed to do. They tried everything. Simulators with moving targets, towed sleeves behind planes, chalkboard diagrams, and painstaking lectures. On paper, it made sense. Show the angles, rehearse the math. But those sterile classrooms couldn't reproduce the real thing. The roar, the freeze of metal, the tracer streaks, the smell of cordite, the tiny clock of survival ticking in a young man's head. Under that pressure, the conscious calculations collapsed and the old instinct took over. Point at the danger, not the empty sky where it will be. Which is why no amount of diagrams mattered once a turret shook and the world went white with incoming fire. Inside the freezing ball turret, metal whining and the bomber's hull rattling like a crate, a gunner had just 3 seconds to do impossible math. He had to judge an enemy's speed, angle, and range, track that tiny moving shape through roaring engines and tracer fire, and squeeze the trigger, all while flak and bullets tore the sky apart. It created a deadly feedback loop. The gunner forces himself to lead, squeezes the triggers, and watches bright tracers stitch the sky, shimmering bursts that smack into empty air a few yards in front of the fighter. In those frozen seconds, his eyes and instincts betray him. The obvious evidence says, "You're overshooting." Panic short-circuits the math. He chops his aim back, a little at first, then more, trying to chase those phantom hits until his rounds fall behind the plane instead of ahead of it. Under 3 seconds of cold, roaring pressure, that loop turns training into survival by guesswork and misses into corpses. His panicked brain screams, "You're missing! You're aiming too far ahead!" A raw animal command that drowns out training and math. He watches his tracers stitch the empty air in front of the fighter, bright orange streaks where nothing lives, and his hands twitch. He shortens the lead. He drifts the sights forward to chase the visible fire instead of the unseen intercept point. In the ruthless moment, it feels correct. In the physics of motion, it is a catastrophe. Every instinctive correction walks the bullets back toward the plane, then behind it, until bravery and trigger discipline are undone, a pattern the gun cameras would later prove. The gun camera reels are brutal to watch. Tracers arc across empty sky, then across it again, each burst a confession. Gunners literally walking their fire backward, pulling their aim closer and closer until rounds punch past the fuselage or explode harmlessly behind the attacker. You can see the moment the brain rewrites the rules, panic wins over training, and the whole system, not just the man behind the trigger, breaks down. Those frames make the crisis undeniable. This wasn't random bad luck or cowardice. It was a predictable, physiological trap that left formations exposed and set the stage for disasters like the Schweinfurt raids. October 1943, the Schweinfurt raid, became proof that courage and firepower were not enough. Wave after wave of B-17s poured toward their targets, gunners hugging their sights, tracers streaking like desperate prayers. Anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters carved the sky, and yet the guns, when they fired, often found only air. Men in turrets did everything they had been taught. They climbed out into cold and smoke and hope, and still the returns were terrible. Entire formations mauled, crews lost, missions undone. The guns worked, the men were brave, the bullets kept missing. The Allied bombing campaign was bleeding out. Planes, crews, and morale drained away faster than factories could replace them. Men in briefing rooms counted not just wreckage, but seconds. How long a fighter needed to cross a bomber's field of fire? How many rounds vanished into empty air? Commanders stopped blaming luck or courage and started looking for a cause they could fix. Engineers, trainers, and grizzled vets were pulled into frantic meetings, experiments, and data hunts. It wasn't just tactics they needed, it was an explanation that would change everything. So their search dug deeper and eventually pointed to a dusty archive and a forgotten 1924 paper. The trail finally ran cold until a clerk in a back office pulled a box from a shelf and blew decades of dust into the light. Inside was a brittle, yellowing paper, stamped and forgotten. A 1924 technical memo by a British artillery officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle. At first, it looked like dry ballast, diagrams, tables, a soldier's neat handwriting. But as they read, the room went quiet. Puckle had already done the math, sketched the geometry, and warned that faster planes would make instinct useless. It was an uncomfortable prophecy, written 2 decades before anyone believed it mattered. In an era of canvas wings and wind-in-your-face cockpits, James Puckle did something almost nobody else did. He sat down with a pencil and numbers and treated those fragile planes like moving geometry. He measured speeds, timed flight paths, calculated where a bullet would be by the time it reached a crossing target. The conclusions were ugly and unavoidable. On paper, the tiny lead time turned into a yawning problem. Once aircraft sped up past a certain point, aiming at the plane itself was literally the wrong move. Puckle didn't just warn of trouble, he had already sketched the shape of the crisis to come. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle wasn't being paranoid, he'd done the math. He calculated that once aircraft speeds climbed past roughly 150 miles per hour, the simple instinct to point at the threat would systematically fail. Bullets take time to get there. Planes move in that time. The fix isn't intuition, it's geometry and timing, a moving goal problem that unfolds faster than conscious thought can process. Beyond that threshold, a trained eye can become a liability. You see the enemy, and your brain tells you to shoot at it, exactly the wrong move. Puckle's note laid down a stark warning. Without mechanical help, aerial gunners would soon be obsolete. Puckle had written a cold, precise warning. Once aircraft speeds topped about 150 miles per hour, human intuition would no longer reliably calculate the deflection needed to hit a moving target. Without a mechanical brain to do the sums, aerial gunners would, within a decade, be fighting physics more than the enemy. He proved right. History would show tracer streams arcing past fighters, brave young men firing at ghosts while the sky took its toll. The tragic irony is that this wasn't a failure of courage, it was arithmetic. And yet, as aviation leapt forward between the wars, his paper was mostly shelved and forgotten. But in the roaring, fast-forward years between the wars, Puckle's warning slid under the radar. Aviation was leaping ahead, faster planes, stranger angles, and the paper gathered dust. Military schools kept teaching what was comfortable: sight alignment, trigger discipline, bullseye marksmanship. They trained young gunners to hit a static target on a range, not a screaming fighter crossing their path at 300 miles per hour. The result was a dangerous mismatch. Doctrine frozen in the past while the sky raced into the future. That gulf between theory and reality would have to be bridged, and it took a desperate commander to dig the old paper back up. For months, Captain Robert Williams refused to accept the easy answers: more ammo, tougher drills, or blaming boys for being scared. So he crawled into the Army's dusty files and found what everyone else had missed: Puckle's 1924 paper, a dry, prescient set of equations that described exactly the weakness eating the air war. He slammed the pages onto a table in a high-command meeting and, in plain English, translated decades of math into a single, terrifying insight. This wasn't a failure of courage or weaponry, it was a failure of geometry, and suddenly the brass could see why their gunners were dying. The problem wasn't the men or the guns, it was the math. Bullets take time to travel. Planes don't sit still. So hitting a weaving fighter isn't marksmanship, it's a moving geometry problem that has to be solved in the blink of an eye. Picture a terrified 19-year-old, cramped in a freezing turret, tracers screaming past, 3 seconds to react. You can drill him until he's blue in the face, but you can't teach live trigonometry under enemy fire. That mismatch, human instinct versus ballistic reality, made the loss rates inevitable. Fixing it would require a different kind of solution, and it would come from somewhere unexpected. Then the answer arrived from an unlikely corner: Britain. In 1940, RAF Squadron 609, flying those nimble, legendary Spitfires, was wrestling with the exact same cruel math. Fast, tiny targets that laughed off straight aim. What made this moment different wasn't new hardware or fresh theory, but a stubborn willingness to try something radical. The pilots weren't content to keep blaming training or nerves. They looked at the problem and asked a sharper question. What if the fix wasn't more calculation, but a different kind of practice? One that taught the body to move before the mind caught up. Their commander, Horace Darley, wasn't some ivory tower theorist. He was an avid clay pigeon shooter who trusted the reflexes you can't teach with diagrams. To him, aiming was a trap. The best shots didn't lock on to the bird and think their way through the lead. They moved with it, felt the offset in their hands and eyes, and fired almost without conscious thought. That idea sounded reckless when applied to Spitfires, but Darley saw a pattern. Fast targets beat slow thinking. So he took a gamble. To beat speed with instinct, he would force his pilots to stop aiming and start feeling. In the middle of the Battle of Britain, Darley grounded his entire squadron for 3 days, an act that looked like madness. Every hour in the air was precious. To pull fighters away from combat was risky, even sacrilegious. But he wanted a different answer. Radical, hands-on experiments to force pilots to stop aiming and learn to track and feel the lead. Darley did something almost criminal in its simplicity. He told his pilots to stop pointing and start moving. On the flight line, they towed a canvas target, and his order was blunt. Fire, but don't aim. Track the target with your whole body. Bank the Spitfire with it. Turn with it. Pull the trigger when your sight and your motion agree. It went against every drills and zero theory they'd learned. At first, the rounds scattered. Then, as the pilots let their bodies lead and shut off the frantic thinking, the bullets began to find the target. At first, it was messy. Tracers streaking wide, pilots cursing, coaches scratching their heads. Then, almost like flipping a switch, something clicked. Instead of jerking the stick and staring down the barrel, pilots relaxed their grip, stopped trying to aim with sight and will, and let their bodies follow the target. They tracked the tow line with a smooth, continuous motion, squeezed the trigger when the muscles said to, not when the mind insisted. The result was immediate and brutal. Hit rates doubled. Not because of better guns, but because the flyers finally trusted their subconscious motion sense to do the math their conscious brain couldn't. Darley's report landed like a bombshell. Your conscious brain is slow. The body sees motion. The subconscious answers, fast, fluid, pre-verbal. He argued that the best shooters weren't thinking through angles and math. They were moving with the target, letting reflex and rhythm do the work. That idea flipped training on its head. Instead of drilling calculations, you taught pilots to trust a felt sense, to track and flow, to let the hands and eyes sync without orders from the mind. It worked beautifully for nimble fighter pilots, but there was a catch, and that catch would matter badly for men stuck behind fixed guns. American observers took Darley's lesson home and then ran into a brutal truth. A fighter pilot can swing an entire airplane to meet his gut, bleed into the motion, and let instinct do the rest. A bomber gunner sits in a little metal ball, frozen in space. His world a 3-second window and a chunk of sky he can't move toward. You can teach him the theory, drill the wingspan rules, yell until your throat is raw, but under fire, the brain snaps back to its oldest reflex, point at the threat. For a stationary gunner, that reflex was a death sentence. He needed something that could think for him. He needed a machine to help him. Not more courage, not better ammo, but something that could do the ugly arithmetic his panicked mind never could. So, in a windowless lab at MIT, a team quietly set out to build it. The radiation laboratory, humming with vacuum tubes and late-night sketches, led by a driven young engineer named Charles Stark Draper. They worked under strict secrecy, testing gyros and servos, arguing over gears and tolerances. driven by briefings that read like emergency memos. It felt improbable, a classroom of theorists trying to buy time for boys in metal tubes. But hope was finally being engineered. At MIT's radiation laboratory, Dr. Charles Stark Draper and his team set out to build exactly what gunners needed. Not another training trick, but a mechanical brain that could do the math for them. It was a small, ruthless calculator made of gyros and gears, designed to watch a target's motion, translate that motion into angles and time, and hand the correct aiming point back to the man in the turret. Suddenly, the impossible math of a screaming fighter and a flying bullet could be solved in an instant. No more frantic head counting at 10,000 feet. Just keep the sight on the plane and let the machine do the thinking. The result was the Mark 14 computing gun sight, a compact, unforgiving little analog computer built from gyroscopes, gears, and clever linkages. It felt almost alive. Where before a panicked young gunner had to do impossible math in a freezing, spinning turret, this device did the math for him, turning speed and angle into motion and light. It didn't fire the gun for you, and it wasn't some futuristic miracle. It was simply brilliant engineering that translated motion into a visible answer. A mechanical brain that let a man stop guessing and start trusting something in his sight. The gunner's job suddenly became almost absurdly simple. Keep a reticle on the target. Don't do the math. Don't guess the speed or the angle. The sight, this little mechanical brain of gyros and gears, watched the target's motion, measured how fast and in what direction it was moving, and turned that data into an exact deflection. In a fraction of a heartbeat, it solved the trigonometry a terrified teenager couldn't do in a shaking turret. And it translated that solution into a visual cue the gunner could follow with his hands, not his head. Hold the reticle, trust the machine, fire. It then projected a second, lighted reticle, the pipper, into the gunner's view, showing him exactly where to aim in that empty patch of sky. The original reticle stayed on the plane, while the pipper hovered ahead, a tiny glowing ghost marking the computed intercept point. No frantic math, no split-second guesses, just a moving dot you could follow. Under fire, the effect was almost calming. Hands steadied, breathing slowed, and that maddening instinct to aim at the plane itself was overridden by something you could see and trust. For the first time, a terrified 19-year-old could aim where the enemy would be, not where it had been. The results were staggering. In 1943 tests, gunners fitted with the Mark 14 saw their hit rate soar from under 5% to over 25%, effectively a 5-fold improvement, turning wild sprays of tracers into real lethal fire. Suddenly, the empty sky filled with consequence. Hits clustered where the pipper commanded. Fighters that had danced through lead before now answered with smoke and flame. That kind of jump didn't just change scores on a table, it changed survival odds for entire formations. But it was not a miracle that could be delivered overnight. The machine existed. The men did not, yet. It was a war-winning technology, but the machines that solved the problem were delicate, complex, and slow to roll off assembly lines. Gyros, gears, and precision optics that couldn't be churned out at wartime speed. So while tests showed the Mark 14 could transform a gunner's aim, most crews never saw one. In late 1943 and early 1944, the majority of gunners were still staring through the same crude, basic sights they'd trained with. The improvement stayed uneven, a life-saving miracle available to a few and a rumor to many. And the front line was screaming for an immediate, field-ready fix. They needed a solution now. It didn't come from a lab or a polished report. It came from a combat-hardened gunner in the Pacific. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming had been shot at enough times to learn by pain. He kept a battered notebook, sketching where he aimed when rounds actually hit, noting angles, distances, and the tiny visual cues that survived under fire. His notes were crude but brutally useful, field-tested rules born of smoke, salt, and loss. It wasn't elegant math. It was a usable shortcut, the kind of practical wisdom that could save crews long before the Mark 14 site reached their turrets. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming was a veteran gunner who kept a detailed notebook, the kind of obsessive log you don't expect from a frontline enlisted man. Pages creased, margins full of tiny sketches, tracer patterns marked in pencil, ranges and angles jotted down between missions. He treated combat like a brutal laboratory. Every burst, every miss, every rare hit became data to be cataloged and tested. He wasn't a physicist, just a man who watched, measured, and recorded what actually worked when lives depended on it. Those scrawled observations would soon prove more valuable than any classroom theory. He wasn't a physicist, but he fought like one, carrying a tiny field lab in the back pocket of his flight jacket. Every engagement became an experiment: angle of approach, speed, where his sights fell on the fuselage, how many tracer rounds before the first smoke. He drew little diagrams, crude plane outlines, arrows, the exact spot he'd aimed when a bomber finally went down, and wrote short notes: sharp crossing, 1 fuselage ahead; shallow, 2 fuselages. It wasn't theory. It was blood. Repetition and stubborn curiosity turned into a user's manual for survival, a notebook that would soon get noticed. In March 1944, Fleming slid a battered notebook across a table, and the legendary fighter ace Edward "Butch" O'Hare leaned in and simply smiled. No long lectures, no jargon, just a handful of crude sketches and notes that somehow turned terrifying trigonometry into something a scared 19-year-old could use in 3 seconds of terror. O'Hare saw at once that this wasn't theory, but a practical shortcut. Measure with the plane, not with angles. So simple it could be taught on the flight deck or in the turret. And his quiet approval would be the spark that turned a lone gunner's scribbles into a life-saving method. Fleming had something better than math. He had a picture. Instead of forcing a terrified kid to calculate feet, angles, and wind in the middle of a firefight, he taught gunners to use the enemy plane itself as a measuring stick. Keep your eyes on the target. Judge how many fuselages or wingspans it takes to reach the spot it will be. No numbers, no trigonometry, just a simple visual rule you can lock into under stress. It was battlefield-born, brutally pragmatic, and the kind of memory that survives stomach drops and tracer fire. No wonder O'Hare called it genius. It was almost embarrassingly simple. Fleming told gunners to stop thinking in yards and angles and use the enemy itself as a ruler. If a plane crossed at a sharp angle, aim 1 full plane length ahead. Put your sights where its fuselage will be, not where it is now. The rule turned geometry into a picture you could hold in your head, a snapshot that survived adrenaline and cold metal. Under fire, you don't do trigonometry. You eyeball a plane and place your burst a plane length forward. The trick scales. Shallower passes mean 2 lengths, near head-ons 3. Simple, visual, repeatable. Then came Fleming's simple scale. Crossing at a sharp angle, aim 1 plane length. A shallower crossing, 2. Nearly head-on, 3. No trigonometry, no frantic counting. Use the airplane itself as your ruler, the wingspan, the fuselage, the distance from nose to tail, and pick 1, 2, or 3. In a freezing turret with seconds to react, a gunner could glance, judge the angle, and fire without doing the math. It turned impossible physics into a tiny visual habit. Aim where the plane will be, not where it is, and suddenly, hitting becomes a repeatable skill. O'Hare didn't bury Fleming's notes in a report. He turned them into a live lesson. He commandeered the Lexington's flight deck, dragged out model planes, and made every gunner practice, hands-on, standing shoulder to shoulder, day and night between launches. No chalkboard math, no sermons, just a simple rule and a wooden model to judge distance and angle with your eyes. Crews tracked, aimed by fuselage lengths, and fired in practice runs until the movement felt right in their arms. It was raw, practical training, built for the real chaos of combat, and it forced the lesson into muscle, not memory. The brilliance of Fleming's idea was its brutal simplicity. Scrap the math, use the target itself as a ruler. Under fire, a panicked gunner couldn't do trigonometry, but he could see a plane and count its length. 1 fuselage ahead for a sharp crossing, 2 for a shallower pass, 3 for a near head-on. It fit into a glance. It fit into a heartbeat. No diagrams, no numbers, just a clear visual rule you could lock onto while the world shook around you. In an instant, an impossible physics problem became something a 19-year-old could do with his eyes and his hands. The results were immediate and dramatic. In a matter of weeks, the flight deck became a coaching clinic. Men pointing, calling out plane lengths, firing with a new, bolder geometry in their heads. And the numbers told the story. Lexington's gunnery accuracy more than doubled in 6 weeks. Tracers that had once arced uselessly into empty sky now stitched into the air where fighters actually were, and crews stopped second-guessing themselves in the split seconds that mattered. Confidence spread as fast as the improvement. Anxious novices began to shoot like veterans. Officers started rethinking doctrine, and the carrier, once vulnerable, became a harder, smarter target. It spread like wildfire because it was stupidly simple and brutally effective. Crews who'd watched Lexington's scores climb began copying the trick. Model planes on flight decks, frantic chalk diagrams in briefing rooms, veteran gunners demonstrating with empty hands, until every carrier had someone teaching spot shooting between flights. Word traveled fast across the Pacific, from hangar to wardroom to sailor on watch, then across radio nets to other task forces. The technique survived salt, stress, and chaos because you could learn it with your eyes, not a slide rule, and because it worked the first time you tried it under fire. Within weeks, the idea wasn't a tip anymore, it was doctrine at sea. By mid-1944, the tide finally turned. The Army Air Forces stopped tinkering and went all in, ripping old drills out of the curriculum and rebuilding gunnery schools from the ground up. Classrooms became dojos of motion, live tracking, model aircraft, timed runs, and instructors teaching simple, brutal rules instead of abstract trigonometry. The emphasis shifted from pure marksmanship to learning where the target would be, not where it was. It was fast, ugly, practical work, the sort of training you could actually use under fire, and it laid the groundwork for a single clear rule that would replace math in the turret: lead by wingspans and fuselage lengths. It changed the lesson plan overnight. Stop teaching calculus, teach visuals. Trainees were told to forget feet and degrees and instead use the enemy as their ruler. 1 wingspan ahead for a steep crossing, 2 fuselages for a shallower pass, 3 for a near head-on. A simple, almost childlike rule you could hold in a freezing turret with tracer rounds cutting the air. In practice, this meant drills with model planes, stringed targets, and endless repetition until the measurement lived in the eye, not the mind. Fleming's battlefield shortcut became doctrine. It was easy to teach, easy to remember, and finally usable under fire, ready to combine with new computing sites and actually save lives. As those new methods and the computing sites finally found their rhythm, the sky began to change. Tracer streams that once flashed by empty air now bit into enemy tails. Fighters peeled away smoking, and whole formations stopped unraveling mid-mission. It was a steady, stubborn improvement. Accuracy climbing from almost nothing to something that actually mattered. Less a miracle than a slow, mechanical justice delivered by better training, simpler rules of thumb, and a little analog brain that did the math for terrified young hands. For the first time in months, crews came home with planes intact. Still, the gains were fragile. The mind of the gunner was still the final battleground. But there was one last demon to conquer, the gunner's own mind. How could they ensure training held up under the extreme stress of combat? Because in the turret, everything changed. For a terrified 19-year-old facing tracer fire and screaming engines, instincts rule. Your eyes lock. Your finger points at the danger. You see tracers fanning across empty air and your brain screams, "Correct!" So you pull back, walk your fire into the plane, and miss. 3 seconds to react. 30 yards of metal and a lifetime of fear. No sight, no rule, no diagram could harden that reflex. Could training survive when the mind turns traitor? That was the real test. Even with the right knowledge, combat stress could trigger something grimmer than any enemy fighter: threat fixation collapse. Under fire, a gunner's brain narrows, vision tunnels, breath quickens, and every reflex rushes back to the oldest, loudest command: point at the threat and squeeze. In a turret, those instincts are deadly. A man who's practiced leading by wingspans can, in a heartbeat, lock his sights on the plane itself, watch tracers streak harmlessly past, and yank his aim backward until he's shooting at empty air. Years of training wiped out in a single panicked second. The result was simple and brutal. Accuracy evaporated when it was needed most. There was no shortcut. The only cure was repetition. Not a lesson, not a diagram, but doing the hard thing over and over until the mind stopped arguing and the body just did. Under fire, freeze-frame calculations fail. What wins is immediate, automatic response. So crews practiced until leading the target became reflex. Thousands of rounds, hundreds of hours, 1,000 tiny feedback loops of tracer, miss, correction, hit that rewired perception. Repetition taught the eye to judge motion, the hand to hold lead, the brain to ignore the panic. It made aiming at empty sky feel like the most natural thing in the world. Jacksonville's Naval Air Gunner School perfected that brutal cure. They built motorized turrets along the shoreline and towed fast, low targets across the water, recreating the speed and surprise of real attacks. Trainees sat in the sights, watched tracers spit and splash, felt the machine's rhythm, and learned from instant feedback. Hit, miss, adjust, over and over until leading the target stopped being a thought and became reflex. At Jacksonville, they stopped talking and started drilling. Motorized turrets, targets skimming across the water. The same pass repeated until hands and eyes synced. Trainees made 50 to 70 runs a day, not listening to instructors so much as feeling the rhythm. Track, squeeze, watch the splash. There was no classroom math, no diagrams, just immediate feedback. A hit, a miss, an adjustment the body made before the mind caught up. Day after day, those tiny corrections stacked, wire by wire, until aiming became reflex. What lectures failed to teach in weeks, repetition hammered into muscle in days. It wasn't theory anymore. It was the brain rewired by consequence. Repetition became a ruthless teacher, a tracer that spat past the enemy, a shell that scored, the tiny, immediate feedback of hit or miss, each one a corrective pulse that reshaped reflexes faster than any classroom could. Day after day, making 50, even 70 passes, trainees felt their conscious calculations fall away. Sight, hand, and shoulder started to move as one. The body learned to predict motion before the mind could name it, trading rules and angles for an embodied sense of lead. Those split-second corrections didn't just improve accuracy, they turned shooting into instinct. The few who made it past 30 missions became something else entirely. Not just skilled, but automatic. Their hands moved before their thoughts did. In the turret, time seemed elastic. Tracers bloomed, the world narrowed to a single motion, and split-second corrections happened without debate. They didn't aim so much as flow with the enemy, matching velocity and angle by feel, a practiced rhythm learned in the gut. Composure replaced panic. When one veteran opened up, the whole formation felt it, a wall of steady, lethal fire where hesitation once lived. But that state wasn't magic. It demanded a price most never paid. But getting to that no-mind state wasn't a weekend course or a pep talk. It ate ammunition and time. Thousands of rounds, hundreds of hours in cramped turrets and on rolling decks, repeating the same motion until your brain stopped thinking and the muscles simply reacted. Most crews never saw that luxury. Combat cycles, replacements, and casualty rates chewed through men before habit could harden. The result was a brutal lottery in the sky. Some formations developed a nearly automatic lethal rhythm, while others stayed raw, hesitant, and deadly exposed. An inconsistency enemy pilots would soon learn to exploit. This created a stark inconsistency in the sky. Some bomber boxes bristled with lethal rhythmic fire. Others spat nervous, wasted rounds into the clouds. German pilots noticed. They became detectives in the air, making gentle feints, sliding past the formation at different angles, watching where tracers thudded harmlessly and where flak answered with deadly precision. They probed, slowly, patiently, seeking the seams in the defensive blanket, the crews that hadn't logged the hours, the men whose instincts still betrayed them. When they found a weak spot, they didn't waste time. They honed in, exploited it, and the price was paid in aircraft and lives. They learned to pick apart a formation. Probing runs would thread the gaps, searching for one thing, the telltale scatter of a green crew, hesitant aim, late leads, tracers that snaked wide. The instant they found it, German pilots pounced. Fast, brutal, surgical. A single nervous gunner could turn a whole bomber into an open target. But a veteran crew was different. They didn't fire randomly. They wove their guns into a single, moving net, overlapping arcs, timed bursts, tracers that braided together until there was nowhere safe to fly. Each gunner knew his sector, anticipated the angle, fed off the man on either side, and the whole formation breathed as one weapon. Attacking was no longer a gamble. It was walking into a curtain of lead. Approaching a seasoned box of bombers wasn't courage, it was suicide. That terrifying, disciplined accuracy was the hard-won payoff of training, instinct, and the new tools that were changing the air war. But the revolution born in World War II, the brutal lesson to aim where the target will be, didn't end with patchwork fixes or a few better crews. It became a thread that stitched gyroscopes, analog brains, carrier deck hacks, and desperate field notebooks into a new doctrine. Make the machine do the math, and teach the human to trust the sight. From the Mark 14's mechanical pipper to radar, digital computers, and guided missiles, every step carried that same insight forward. Today, whether a Phalanx CIWS or an air-to-air missile, the rule is unchanged. You fire not at what you see, but at the future you predict. The mechanical Mark 14 gave way to digital brains. By Vietnam, radar-assisted sights had taken over the ugly human math. Sensors measuring range and closure, onboard calculators turning that data into exact lead angles in a heartbeat. No more frantic guesses from a freezing turret. The sight did the predicting. The gunner simply followed a light or trusted the system. Reaction times plunged, hit rates climbed, and the whole chore of aiming where it will be moved from muscle and instinct into chips and sensors. That shift didn't just improve gunnery, it rewired how we fight and set the stage for the fully automated systems that dominate the skies today. Today, that hard-learned lesson, aim where the target will be, sits at the very center of modern warfare. Missiles don't chase visible metal, they fly to calculated intercept points, guided by sensors, inertial computers, and predictive algorithms that solve the same deflection problem faster than any human eye. Fighters like the F-22 run those calculations thousands of times a second. Shipboard CWAS watches an incoming threat and fires where the aircraft will be, not where it is. What began with a terrified 19-year-old learning to fire at empty sky has become a universal rule. Predict the future, and you win the fight. By the time a human eye locks on a bandit, the F-22's computers have already crunched trajectories, predicted motion, and picked an intercept point, thousands of times a second. There's no frantic mental math, no last-second guesswork, no aiming at where the enemy is now.
Sensors feed velocity and vector into processors that spin out where the target will be, and the aircraft, its radar, missiles, and flight controls line up to meet that future point. It's the old problem of leading the target solved by silicon and speed. Instinct handed over to instruments, turning what once felt like magic into routine, invisible precision. From gyroscopes and gears to microchips, the same problem, the need to aim where the target will be, never went away.
Automated defense systems, like the Navy's Phalanx CIWIS, are the heirs of that hard-earned lesson. Tiny radars and blazing processors measure an incoming threat, compute an intercept point, and fire in the fraction of a second no human could match. They don't feel fear, they don't get tunnel vision, they simply do the math and put rounds where they must be. In a way, every Phalanx turret is a tribute to those young gunners, proof that the solution was never more bullets, but better thinking, faster machines. Even video games teach this lesson. In arcades and on consoles, players don't do the trigonometry. They learn to push the crosshair ahead of a moving target, fire where the enemy will be, not where it is. Hundreds of tiny corrections, instant feedback, and sheer repetition build the same unconscious competence WW2 gunners struggled for under fire. It's a bitter, beautiful irony. A survival skill born in freezing turrets and salt spray now lives in pixels and controllers, practiced for fun. That habit, aiming at empty air and trusting the sight, became the simple mental shift that turned misses into hits. It wasn't a marginal improvement, it was a revolution. When accuracy climbed from a desperate 4% to better than 20%, whole formations stopped being easy prey. Fewer bombers went down, crews came home, missions could be flown with real teeth. But the victory wasn't only mechanical. It demanded men unlearn a life-saving reflex: point at the danger. Through sights, rules of thumb, and brutal repetition, gunners were taught to aim at the empty patch of sky where the enemy would be. That counterintuitive discipline, aiming at nothing, turned scattershot desperation into effective defense and redefined how we fought from the sky. Those gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, who forced themselves to fire at nothing and trust the geometry instead of their gut, did more than improve accuracy. They proved something fundamental about human adaptability. Under the right pressure and feedback, our brains can be retrained to override instincts that once saved us and now kill us. Muscle memory replaced panic. Simple visual rules beat frantic calculation. The change wasn't elegant, it was brutal, slow, paid for in lives. Yet out of that brutal schooling came a new kind of courage. The courage to mistrust what you see and to act on what you know. We are not prisoners of our instincts. Once you strip the panic away and replace guesswork with understanding, the impossible becomes teachable. Once you grind the motion into muscle memory and give frightened hands a simple rule or a small machine to obey, the brain rewrites itself. Desperation fast-tracked that change. Meanwhile, tools like computing sites and visual rules of thumb turned a lethal guessing game into a repeatable skill. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't come cheap. But the stubborn truth is this: with the right knowledge, practice, and the will to change, people can learn to aim at empty sky and still hit their target, a lesson bought at terrible cost. That lesson, paid for in blood over Europe and the Pacific, became more than a technical fix. It was a revelation about who we are when the world demands more than instinct. Under fire, men learn to distrust the urge to point at what scares them and to trust a quiet, counterintuitive rule: aim where the threat will be, not where it stands. It cost lives. It rewired training, machines, and minds. And it taught something braver than courage: the willingness to act against your gut, to trust a calculation you cannot feel, and to fire at empty sky because, in that empty sky, victory waits.